Good evening. It is time for Chapter 5 of Affirmative Action Around the World. Chapter 5. So, we are on to Affirmative Action in Nigeria. There are a total of 7 uh, chapters in this book, by the way. So, 2 more readings. All right. Excuse me. Affirmative Action in Nigeria. Like many a country which emerged from colonial rule, Nigeria was never a country before colonial rule. Okay. Its very name was given to it by its British rulers. More important, it was an amalgamation of many very diverse West African communities, a fact that was to have fateful implications for its future as a multi ethnic state. The regions brought together under British hegemony were not only different ethnically, they were different economically, culturally, and geographically. Islamic conquests from the north were in progress when British conquest intervened. The Muslim Fulani where'd I get group? The word is tribe. Where did I get group? I don't know. The Muslim Fulani tribe had conquered the Hausa tribe in the north, but not the Yoruba or Igbo tribes in the south, when the British rule was extended over them all. Although these were and are the largest ethnic groups in Nigeria, there are numerous other tribes, some exclusive to a given territory and others scattered among larger tribal groups. While these various groups are called tribes in Nigeria, they are by no means all small bands of people. Some tribes number in the millions and are scattered over areas larger than some nations in Europe. Nigeria has the largest population of any nation in Africa, and 1 out of every 8 Africans is a Nigerian. Internally, Nigeria is fragmented by language, religion, and ethnicity. There is no majority group in any of these respects. The largest of the ethnic groups are the Hausa Fulani tribes of the northern region, constituting about 28% of the country's population. The next largest group, about 18% of the population, are the Igbos, with the Yorubas from the southwestern region being very similar in size at 17%. Altogether, there are hundreds of smaller tribes. More than demographic or even cultural differences are involved. These tribal divisions are accompanied by deeply felt alienation and hostility among many of these groups. A 1970 study of Nigerian students studying abroad in Edinburgh found that among the Yoruba, more than 40% of the males and more than 60% of the females excluded the possibility of friendship with a Hausa. Marriage with a Hausa was excluded by more than 80% of the males and more than 90% of the females. Among the Igbos, similar proportions would exclude marriage with Hausas or with Yorubas. Such alienation has social, political, and economic implications. An econometric study in 1997 estimated that Nigeria's economic growth rate would have been almost double its actual rate if its ethnic diversity were only average for African nations instead of being nearly double the average. History. Geographically more fortunate than many other parts of the sub-Saharan Africa, the region of West Africa, now called Nigeria, contains the Niger River and its tributaries, facilitating the development of towns and villages, which have long been more common in this region than in most of tropical Africa. About half the population of Nigeria lived in these urban communities before the beginning of the 20th century. Nigeria has also had larger and more complex indigenous political systems than those in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and has been more advanced in other ways. For example, iron was smelted in what is now Nigeria 5 centuries before Christ. Islam came to the northern regions of the country 5 centuries ago, while the southeastern region, inhabited by the Igbos, became predominantly Christian in the wake of British missionary activity and later British political hegemony. The southwestern region, inhabited by the Yoruba, has become roughly half Islamic and half Christian, while indigenous African religions also continue to be practiced. In centuries past, the coastal peoples of the region were more powerful and more advanced than the peoples of the interior, as in much of the rest of the world. As elsewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, these coastal peoples raided and enslaved their less fortunate brethren in the interior. In this case, the Igbos. The Igbos. The Igbos have been described by a scholar largely sympathetic to Africans as having barely advanced beyond the state of savagery in the early 20th century. This was said not in denigration of the Igbos, but rather to accentuate their rapid rise later in that century. The British became involved in West Africa in the 19th century, seeking to advance and protect various British interests, including British missionaries and traders, by establishing a sphere of influence. Britain's historic decision to ban the international slave trade in 1808 led not only to the banishment of slave trading from the British Empire, but also to the suppression of the slave trade in other places, including its principal sources in sub-Saharan Africa. Whether or not the colonial officials realized it at outset, this entailed a long-run political and military involvement in the region, while the British Navy patrolled the Atlantic off the west coast of Africa to deter and intercept slave shipments to the Western Hemisphere, reluctant to incur the expense of establishing and administering a colony. The British were nevertheless drawn into local political and military conflicts among the various contending Africans. Eventually, the British sphere of influence evolved into British rule in the 20th century, though indirect rule through local indigenous authorities. What the British attempted was what might be called low budget imperialism, with local societies, political structures, and cultures left as much as they had been as possible. Despite their conservative agenda, however, the British presence was itself a transforming and even revolutionary influence. Unwilling to bear the high costs of staffing their colonial administration from top to bottom with people from Britain, the British hired local Nigerians as clerks and in other subordinate occupations. This in turn meant creating a whole new class of Africans with English language education, familiar with Western concepts and experienced in Western ways of doing things. This class intended to become critical this class tended to become critical of indigenous African institutions and authorities, and eventually also critical of British authorities and their colonial rule. Group differences. British rule also had major effects on the relationships among the various peoples of Nigeria. Some of these peoples were more receptive than others to the Western education now being offered by missionaries, leading to great disparities in the number of educated indigenous people in the different regions. The Muslim authorities in the north, for example, did not want Christian missionaries establishing schools in their region. Since virtually all schools in Nigeria were missionary schools during the colonial era. Oh, we are in an ad. So I will hang out with you here for a minute. Like we have an ad for a grommet uh, pliers. Interesting. Okay, let's see. Let's start back at the Muslim authorities. And remember, he spells it Moslem. That's why I'm pronouncing it that way. I know it's Muslim or Muslim, but it's Muslim in this, so that's how I'm going to pronounce it. So, the Muslim authorities in the north, for example, did not want Christian missionaries establishing schools in their region, since virtually all schools in Nigeria were missionary schools during the colonial era. This left the north lagging far behind the south in modern education and the skills and economic experience growing out of it. Moreover, after the British established their hegemony over the various African tribes, it was now safe for people from one region of Nigeria to travel and even settle in what had once been enemy territory before the colonial era. This led to a large influx of southern Nigerians into the north, not only to staff colonial institutions, but also to establish themselves in business and in various modern occupations in the private sector. Hey Vesper, how you doing tonight? Good to see you. Always glad to have you come in. We're reading about affirmative action in Nigeria tonight. One of the groups particularly prone to seize upon the opportunities presented by Western education were the Igbos of the southeastern Nigeria, a group once lowly and backwards, who now rose up the occupational ladder, often above their erstwhile superiors. These erstwhile superiors, particularly in the North, did not take this social reversal with good grace. As Nigeria approached its independence in 1960, intergroup jealousies and friction delayed the creation of a constitution and a government, which in turn delayed independence itself. The British were prepared to grant independence before the various ethnic groups within Nigeria were prepared to agree to accept it, since they had first to iron out their disagreements on a constitution. Good. He said, Vesper says, good. How are you? I am doing great. Um, I missed my Star Wars reading last night. I got hung up on other stuff and didn't get to do that, but that's okay. We're back to this book, and I am enjoying the book, even though it's maybe not quite what I was expecting. I'm not sure what I was expecting, but there you go. Um, I imagine he's going to bring it all together in the last chapter. So we've got two more readings after this. So there's one more country he's going to do. The um, I just went blank on the word affirmative action. Jeez. He's going to do one more country and then he's going to bring it all together in the seventh chapter. So, all right, back to the reading. Although the upstart group whose rise was particularly resented were the Igbos, the Yorubas had the highest per capita income of any of these groups. The southeastern region, where the Igbos originated, had less fertile land and had long lagged behind other regions in economic level and urbanization, a fact which led many ambitious and Western educated Igbos to migrate elsewhere to pursue their careers. This in turn led to their being widely interspersed among other peoples hostile to them. Northern authorities, for example, insisted that Igbos live in separate communities and send their children to segregated schools. Around in the middle of the 20th century, as independence approached, per capita income in the western Yoruba region was twice that in the northern Hausa Fulani region, with the eastern Igbo region income being in between. These economic differences reflected in part the fact that educational differences among the tribes and regions remained extremely extreme throughout the colonial era. As of 1912, for example, there were fewer than 1,000 students in elementary school in northern Nigeria, where more than half the population of the country lived, while there were 35,000 students attending primary schools in the southern regions. While Western education grew over time in all regions of Nigeria, the huge disparities continued. In 1957, when there were approximately 185,000 children enrolled in elementary school education in the northern regions, there were 2.3 million in the other regions, whose combined populations were not as large. Similar disparities existed and persisted in secondary and higher education. As of 1951, only one person out of the 16 million people in the northern region had a university degree. Virtually all the Nigerian students in institutions of higher learning, whether overseas or at home, were from southern Nigeria. In academic year 1959-1960, on the eve of independence, northern Nigerians were just 9% of the students at the country's University of Ibadan. Among the much larger number of Nigerian students receiving a higher education abroad, only 2% were Hausa Fulani as late as 1966, 6 years after independence. Such disparities in higher education were reflected in occupational disparities, especially in the higher professions. Of the 160 physicians in Nigeria in the early 1950s, 76 were Yorubas, 49 were Igbos, and only one was from the Hausa Fulani group, the largest group in the population. In the Army, three-quarters of the riflemen were Hausa Fulani, while four-fifths of the officers were Southerners. As late as 1965, one-half of the officer corps were specifically Igbos. Even within the northern region, southern Nigerians outnumbered northern Nigerians in many coveted occupations. These included not only occupations requiring medical or technical skills, but also clerical and other semi-skilled jobs in the postal service, banks, and the railroad, and Southerners were also prominent as traders, artisans, merchants, and factory workers in northern Nigeria. Among senior public officials in northern Nigeria, more than four-fifths were expatriates, mostly Europeans, but a few from other African countries. And about one-third of the Nigerians in such positions in the north were Southerners. This this dependency on outsiders was very different from the situation in the eastern and southern regions of Nigeria. In each of these other regions, Nigerians were roughly three-quarters of the senior public officials. Among the spoils of independence were government jobs currently held by Europeans, and while a policy of Nigerianization of such jobs was proclaimed in the northern region, the policy was more specifically northernization. There, the emphasis was on expelling southern Nigerians from these jobs, even if that required replacing them for the time being with European expatriates because of a lack of qualified northern Nigerians. National independence. Demands for independence came first from the southern and eastern regions of Nigeria, while northern Nigerian officials resisted until they could get some constitutional guarantees that the country's administrative apparatus would not be dominated by officials from the other regions. Northern Nigeria, where a majority of the country's population lived, was the politically dominant region of the country, but the central government apparatus required to carry out policy, the bureaucracy, would clearly not be if hiring for government positions were to be on the basis of individual qualifications alone. Those positions were important not only as a means of controlling the application of whatever policies the political leaders might choose, but also as a source of patronage, assuring the continuation in power of incumbent northern politicians. Both the northern resistance to early independence and its insistence on group representation in federal government positions put them in conflict with the leaders and peoples of the other regions. All clearly understood the high stakes involved in these conflicts, and both sides reacted with hostility and bitterness. As one northern leader later confessed, quote, "We had to teach the people to hate the Southerners, to look at them as people depriving them of their rights," end quote, so as to gain the political support of the northern population. Another northern spokesman said, quote, "The South, with its many schools and colleges, is producing hundreds of academically and technically qualified people for the public services. The common cry now is Nigerianization of the public services. It is most important that the federal service shall be fully representative of all units which make up the federation. Now, what do we find in Nigeria today? There are 45,000 men and women in the federal public services. I have not been able to obtain the figures of the number of Northerners in the service, but I very much doubt if they even amount to 1%. End quote. In short, the Northern position was that group representation was more important than individual skills. One advocate of the group representation rejected what he called, quote, the tyranny of skills, end quote. Some of this is sounding kind of familiar. This was not simply an issue to be settled in the political arena after independence. Northern fears of Southern domination of the administrative apparatus of government led to opposition to early independence without some prior guarantees of Northern representation in the bureaucracy. In turn, this provoked Southern hostility to Northern leaders. In 1953, after a motion in the House of Representatives located in Lagos in the South, asking the British to grant independence in 1956, was opposed by the Northern members, those members were later surrounded by groups of Igbos and Yoruba who called them thieves, slaves of the white man, and stupid Hassas. Okay. Tyranny of competence. Yes, exactly. Tyranny of competence. Afterwards, when advocates of early independence took their case to the people in the North, they were met with riots fomented by Northern political leaders in which dozens of people were killed and more than 100 wounded. In an effort to diffuse the situation, the British held a conference in London at which it was decided to allow more regional autonomy. As a result of this, between January 1954 and August 1958, more than 2,000 Southerners were fired by the Northern Public Service and urged to go south. Nor could they be immediately replaced by qualified Northern Nigerians, hence the large number of expatriates employed. Before 1954, there was not a single Northern Nigerian in the administrative cadre of the Northern Public Service. Immediately after the Northernization policy, 5 were appointed, and by 1958 there were a little over 300. But they had still not replaced all the Southerners fired earlier. Although such group preferences were initially limited to the government employment, they began to spread into the private sector as a result of Northern government actions. European firms in northern Nigeria, which intended to hire southern Nigerians for responsible positions, found themselves under political pressure to hire northerners instead. In addition, the local government also provided loans to northern Nigerian businessmen trying to compete with southern Nigerians who were more successful. Ironically, one of the political advocates of the northernization policies himself hired Igbos rather than other northerners in his private businesses. Apparently, the belief that southern Nigerians were more efficient was not just a perception or stereotype. Given such intergroup hostility, it was perhaps not surprising that the first decade of Nigeria's independence was marked by riots, plots, and coups. The country's first census had to be nullified amid charges of fraud. Early in, early in 1966, the prime minister was assassinated in the course of a military coup. Because he was from the Muslim northern region and most of the coup leaders were Igbo military officers from the Christian South, this set up a fateful backlash in which the new military government was rebelled against and then overthrown in a counter coup in July of the same year by Muslim military officers. By September, the backlash against the Igbos took the form of new and bloodier riots in the north. Quote, Northern soldiers chased Igbo troops from their barracks and murdered scores with bayonets. Screaming Muslim mobs descended on the Igbo quarters of every northern city, killing their victims with clubs, poison arrows, and shotguns. Tens of thousands of Igbos were murdered in the systematic massacres that followed. End quote. And Vesper says one of the biggest causes of stuff like this was combining multiple ethnicities into single nations. Well, yeah, absolutely, and that's I think his whole point in this chapter is they were already a bunch of warring tribes taking up different parts of the region, and it was the British that basically turned this group, this disparate group, into a nation and tried to make it work, and we're seeing the result here. Okay. After these traumatic events, more than 1 million Igbos fled the northern region to join their fellow Igbos in the southeastern part of the country. This region then decided to secede from Nigeria, where they no longer felt safe, and form their own independent country, which they named Biafra. This is in turn set off a civil war that lasted 2 years. The Nigerian government blockaded this landlocked region to prevent food or military supplies from reaching it. Igbos then starved to death at a rate of 1,000 a day. Altogether, more than 1 million people died in Biafra from a combination of starvation, military actions, and disease. Biafra collapsed and was reabsorbed into Nigeria. After this catastrophic episode, and after all the years of intergroup hostility that preceded it, Nigeria changed to a policy of reconciliation. The devastated economy in the southeastern region was rebuilt, and Igbo political and military personnel were rehabilitated, including some officials of the former Biafran government. Years later, in 1982, when the exiled leader of Biafra was pardoned, Igbos in general resumed their role as a prosperous element in Nigerian society. The federal military government, which took power in July 1966 coup, remained in power until 1979, when a new constitution was written for a return to civilian rule. The new constitution was designed to mitigate ethnic politics by reorganizing political regions in an attempt to break up ethnic blocs. Nevertheless, in the 1979 elections held under the new constitution, each of 5 presidential candidates received an absolute majority of the votes in at least one state and less than 5% of the vote in another state or states. Since Nigeria's major ethnic groups live in different states, this voting pattern represented a continuation of extreme ethnic polarization. What also continued was a large role for government in the economy and rampant corruption in the carrying out of that role. In a very poor country, the central government's control of much of the country's wealth makes the struggle to control the central government desperate and the use of that control shameless. Although not unique in these respects, Nigeria is usually ranked among the most corrupt countries in the world, and in some years an international survey has ranked it as the most corrupt country in the world. Widespread and large-scale financial corruption, $30 million stolen by one state governor, for example, has been accompanied by equally gross electoral fraud in which a defeated, quote unquote, candidate later turned out upon investigation years later to have won by more than 1 million votes. Meanwhile, civil servants' pay fell in arrears, inflation soared, and total national output declined. As public confidence in their elected officials also declined, this set the stage for another military coup in 1983, part of a history of short-lived civilian governments and long-lived military regimes in Nigeria. Even in its more or less legitimate activities, the government of Nigeria has served as an instrument for milking one ethnic group for the benefit of another. In 1961, for example, the northern region paid only 9% of the country's personal income taxes and received 45% of the monies dispensed to the various regions by the federal government. Meanwhile, the western region paid 64% of the country's personal income taxes and received less than 1/4 of the regional funds. In essence, the Yoruba were being drained financially for the benefit of the Hassa Fulani. Preferences and quotas. In addition to various informal ways in which Nigerian governments at state and national levels have practiced favoritism toward one ethnic group over another, more formal systems of ethnic preferences and quotas have been imposed under the requirement that numerous activities must, quote, reflect the federal character of the country, end quote. This expresses ethnic preferences in regional terms. According to a provision of the 1979 Constitution, quote, the composition of the government of the Federation and any of its agencies shall be carried out in such a manner as to reflect the federal character of Nigeria and the need to promote national loyalty, thereby ensuring that there shall be no predominance of persons from a few states or from a few ethnic or other sectional groups in that government or any of its agencies, end quote. Even before this constitutional provision was written, special efforts were made to recruit Northerners into the national government's civilian branches and into its military services. Seeking to redress regional and therefore ethnic imbalances in education, the federal government established both universities and pre-universities remedial educational institutions in the more educationally backward regions. Then it established a joint admissions and matriculation board to control admissions to the country's universities using ethnic quotas. Moreover, similar principles of regional and ethnic balance were applied to a wide range of government activities and projects. Then we have quite a long quote here, takes up half a page. Quote, with the enunciation of the principle of federal character, politicians and ethnic champions, as well as ethnic entrepreneurs, now watch assiduously every aspect of life to make sure that they are not denied any possible benefits arising from the implementation of the concept. Hence demands have arisen over the sitting of industries by the government, the the build the siting sit no sitting the building of roads, hospitals, and schools in various parts of the Federation in conformity with the principle of federal character. Emphasis is placed on balancing the location of socio-economic projects in the North with those in the South. In fact, the iron and steel project of the country was delayed over the demands for balancing in the location of significant national projects. Similarly, the construction of the oil refinery in Kaduna, an area where no crude oil is produced, is motivated in part by the principle of ethno-regional balancing. The location of federally sponsored specialist hospitals has followed the same principle of balancing that inspired the geographic location of the federal government colleges. End quote. As in other countries, the things made available through ethnic balancing have been primarily those things of interest and concern to the more fortunate members of the various ethnic groups, such as university admissions, rather than free and universal compulsory education for the poor. In Nigeria, group preferences concentrate on those things which serve the interests of those people who have already moved out of traditional ways of life and into the modern sectors of the economy and society, with little concern for those still left behind. The federal character principle has been extended to promotions, school admission, and even membership on the national soccer team. Intergroup hostilities have been especially sharp in those modern sectors, such as in the cities, where locally indigenous and non-indigenous groups have confronted one another. Quote, native urban dwellers resent migrants and often seek preferential treatment with respect to urban administration and planning. Non-indigenous dwellers, on the other hand, feel alienated and reluctant to participate in the development of the city. This is especially evident in northern Nigerian cities and in Lagos, where sons of the soil regularly harass strangers. End quote. Because the federal character principle is administered by the federal government, these affirmative action programs have strengthened the role of the central government vis-a-vis state and local governments, which have lost much of their taxing authority and have therefore been forced to rely for the bulk of their income on money received from the national treasury. Moreover, competing ethnic and regional claims on the federal treasury have made something as ordinarily mundane as a census a matter of heated controversy and bitter charges and countercharges of corruption and fraud. Yet, far from settling or refusing intergroup tensions, the administration and application of the federal character principle became itself a matter of unending contention. Regional autonomy allowed the dominant tribal or ethnic group in each region to show favoritism to its own members in the allocation of government jobs, subsidies, and other benefits. Because these represented essentially, whoa, sorry, because these represented essentially preferences and quotas for the majority population of each region, the ability of other groups to challenge such policies politically was limited. However, with the concentration of power in the federal government, more evenly matched regional majorities could more effectively vie for one another for the with one another for the favors of those holding the power of the central government. Whether or not this resulted in more fairness, it resulted in more conflict. Summary and implications. Territorially separated and politically polarized ethnic groups have been a formula for disaster in many countries around the world. Some of these countries have degenerated into civil war, like Sri Lanka and Yugoslavia, or have broken apart either with or without military action, like Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, and first Pakistan from India and then Bangladesh from Pakistan. Nigeria's civil war was part of this general pattern, and its reuniting after breaking apart was one of the more favorable outcomes, tenuous as its national unity has continued to be. Against this background, the effects of group preferences and quotas are harder to assess. Given the huge differences in education and cultures among the different tribes in Nigeria, would a policy of equal opportunity for all, with its inevitable predominance of southern Nigerians in coveted positions, even in northern Nigeria, have been politically viable? It is hard to imagine how such a situation would not have led to political demands for group preferences and quotas, and to mutual recriminations, demonization, and polarization among the different groups. Perhaps a country with a long history of national concerns predominating over regional or tribal differences, or a tradition of equal treatment for all, could have avoided the tragedies which have racked Nigeria. But Nigeria was not such a country. The very idea of making such disparate regions of the British Empire in West Africa into one country was a belated and perhaps ill-advised decision. As far back as 1899, early colonizers recommended breaking the territory of Nigeria into two separate provinces. In the years immediately following independence in 1960, more than one region threatened secession before the Igbos actually seceded to form the ill-fated nation of Biafra. If the goal of group preferences and quotas was to create a sense of national unity, as often proclaimed, there is no evidence that it has in fact advanced that goal or even moved the country in that direction. As a study in 2001 concluded, quote, Nigerians seldom categorize others by their wealth or occupation, but by ethnicity, end quote. This is more than a social custom. It has political implications. As an earlier study put it, quote, to the average Nigerian, a political leader is good only if he is able to patronize members of his family at the expense of other families, to promote the cause of his tribe at the expense of the nation, and if need be, to defend the wrong of a brother at the expense of justice. End quote. In October 2001, the president of Nigeria acknowledged continuing ethnic clashes and found it necessary to reassert the right of any Nigerian citizen, quote, to live and enjoy full citizenship anywhere within this country, end quote. He urged all Nigerians, quote, not to see any fellow Nigerian as a settler in our country where he or she is a citizen by birth, so that we can feel justified to demand that he or she departs our neighborhood when it suits our whims, end quote. Nor have such ethnic clashes subsided months later when a correspondent in Lagos reported, quote, gangs of youths armed with machetes, swords, and bows and arrows took to the streets of Lagos yesterday in a third day of ethnic conflict in which at least 55 people have been killed. Grabbing what possessions they could, thousands left their homes as plumes of black smoke rose from the city's slum. Soldiers were deployed yesterday to help contain the violence, which began on Saturday between Yoruba and Hausa tribal fights in the impoverished northern areas of Idi Araba and Mushin. End quote. Estimates of the number of deaths in intergroup clashes between 1999 and early 2002 ranged from 6,000 to 10,000. If it is difficult to isolate the effects of preferences and quotas as such on Nigeria's troubled history, it is much clearer that the group polarization which preceded and produced the preferences and quotas has been deadly in its effects, both in peace and in war, and under both civilian and military governments. So much rancor and bitterness have been built up in Nigeria before policies, quote, reflecting the federal character of the country, end quote, were instituted, that both the policies and the disasters which followed may be seen as consequences of the same underlying polarization. This situation is somewhat different from that in a country where a majority chooses to grant preferences and quotas to a minority, whether out of a sense of guilt, fear, or magnanimity. In such countries, goodwill may prevail, at least initially, and subsequent polarization may later be attributed to the effects of the policies themselves. In Nigeria, however, both the policies and the poisonous politics which produced them have been inextricably bound up together from the beginning in a situation which unfolded with virtually the inevitability of a Greek tragedy. Only in the wake of repeated disasters have there been steps taken to dampen the ethnic polarization through political restructuring aimed at requiring candidates to demonstrate political support in different regions of the country, which is to say among different ethnic groups. That such efforts have largely failed thus far may be less important in the long run than the fact that the problem has been identified and its importance recognized, which is a necessary prelude to any future actions that might succeed. While preferences cannot be said to have created ethnic polarization in Nigeria as they did in Sri Lanka, nevertheless the question may be asked whether these preferences have eased or accentuated the pre-existing frictions and hostilities among the country's many minorities. In a country with no majority, the prestigious Economic Intelligence Unit in London made this assessment. Very long quote here. Quote, various explanations have been given for the sharp rise in sectarian and communal violence in Nigeria since 1999. The unrest is said to stem from the release of pent-up anger and frustration following years of authoritarian military rule. Unease in the country has also increased as historically fragile relations between predominantly Muslim Northerners and mainly Christian Southerners have been critically strained by the introduction of Sharia, Islamic law, including harsh punishments for offenders in many parts of the North. But the most widely accepted reason for Nigeria's enduring civil unrest is the mistrust between its more than 250 ethnic groups that make up Nigeria, many of which consider themselves separate nationalities. The persistence of racial mistrust reflects the failure of nation building in Nigeria where most people's loyalty is to their ethnic group rather than the nation. End quote. I wondered when they were going to bring up the differences between North and South, because he said early on in the chapter Muslims came down from the North and converted people in the North, and Christians came up from the South and converted the Southerners. And I wondered when somebody would finally mention the possible clashes between those two um, religions. Okay, moving on. From the standpoint of others seeking to glean some lessons from the experience of Nigeria, clearly the spectacle of ethnic groups organized into different political parties, each party exclusively dependent on the votes of one group and all fighting over the dispensation of government largesse, is not one to encourage emulation elsewhere. It is not the simple fact that one group gives the vast majority of its votes to one party that is crucial. That happens in many countries, including the United States, without producing ethnic parties in the sense in which such parties have existed in Nigeria or Sri Lanka, where these parties have freely insulted, demonized, and alienated other groups, and led both countries into civil wars. What must also exist to produce such tragedies is such exclusive preoccupation with intergroup struggles that attacks on other groups provoke no backlash from voters offended by such polarization. That situation existed in the American South during the era when quote unquote white supremacy was loudly proclaimed during election campaigns. When isn't it? Uh, but in the absence of such extreme conditions, parties based on a variety of issues and constituencies have tended to play down or paper over interethnic conflicts that could cost them votes among the general public. What has saved the United States from the fate of Nigeria is that polarizing political tactics have for more than a century been confined to one region of the country, and that the disapproval of many other Americans limited how far such tactics could go. Where there was no such disapproval or unbridled polarization, Americans also had a civil war, even though between two groups that were not racially or ethnically different, but territorially separate. In Nigeria, there was no such concern over polarization or even violence directed against other ethnic groups. For example, during the bloody outbreaks of violence in northern Nigeria that killed tens of thousands of Igbos in 1966, the Yoruba expressed little concern, either from a humanitarian point of view or from the standpoint of the damage to the nation as a whole. India has not had an outright civil war between territorially separated groups, though it has had escalating violence around the country in the wake of polarization among many groups, including in recent years polarization by Hindu politicians targeting Muslims. Malaysia and Singapore have avoided the fates of Nigeria and Sri Lanka partly by not having territorially separate ethnic groups, and has avoided the fate of India by essentially banning free speech on ethnic issues. But where none of these restraints or countervailing forces is at work, Nigeria has been a painful example of what can happen. What has been clear from its experience is that the often repeated idea that attempts at equalizing outcomes through group preferences and quotas would enhance national unity has been proven to be as false in Nigeria as in other countries. The goal of national unity behind policies, quote, reflecting the federal character of the country, end quote, has given the various groups something to fight over rather than something to bring them closer together. The underlying assumption that the degree of economic or other inequality is not only correlated with the degree of intergroup antagonism, but is the main cause of it, may seem plausible to some and may be accepted without question by others, but it does not fit the facts in Nigeria nor in other countries. While the region where the Yoruba are indigenous has long had a higher economic level than the region inhabited by the Igbos, The hostility of the Hassa Fulani toward the upstart Igbos, who were historically closer to their own economic level, has long been far more fierce than that toward the more prosperous Yoruba. Moreover, it was precisely when the Igbos began to close the economic gap between themselves and the Yoruba during the late 1940s that hostilities between Igbos and Yoruba then erupted and escalated. In the 1990s, when the Katafs, formerly lagging behind the Hassa economically, had closed the gap, the relations between these two groups likewise became more polarized than ever, so that, quote, the slightest disagreement tends to explode into violence, end quote. The same phenomenon has been found among other Nigerian tribal or ethnic groups. Similar patterns have existed in other African countries as well as in Asia, Europe, and the Western Hemisphere. In Sri Lanka, for example, the disproportionate success of the Tamils in educational institutions and professional occupations was even greater in the peaceful first half of the 20th century than in the tragically bloody second half. There, as in Nigeria and elsewhere, it was not the economic or other differences as such which provoked polarization and violence, but the politicizing of those differences. Intergroup strife within various regions of Nigeria has led to the creation of more states, first a dozen in 1967 and then 36 in 1966. Having suffered the deadly consequences of conflicts growing out of ethnic heterogeneity, Nigeria has sought to create more homogeneity within separate enclaves in order to diffuse the polarization that has threatened to tear the country apart. And that is the end of that chapter. So that takes us, to chapter 6 for next time, which is affirmative action in the United States. And then we'll have one more chapter after that, which is the past and the future. So, yeah, that's where we'll pick up next time, chapter 6. Let's see. So unless anybody has anything else to add to that, I'll look for somebody to... What nights are these? It'll be Friday for chapter 6 and then Tuesday again for chapter 7. And that'll finish out the book. And then I have a couple other books on my plate that I keep shoving back on the list that I'm going to go ahead and read. And then I'm going to get back to Plato and read the Republic. But first I'm going to read something on the Masons. And then I'm going to be reading a book on slavery, and then I'll get back to the Republic. So, yeah, keep mixing it up, pursuing all the different subjects that I've been covering. So, all right, who we gonna raid tonight? We got Count BB playing Fallout 4. Haven't raided him in a long, long time. Let's go on over there. He hasn't got a real big audience. We'll give him a bit more. So bear with me a couple of minutes while I get us on over there, and I will see you there.
Shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not lights like I've had, but more sophisticated into love.